The autumn wind bit through the thin wool of her coat as the cart rattled its final miles toward the city. She huddled closer to her small, frayed carpet bag, the one containing her other dress, a hairbrush, and a single precious book of sheet music. The countryside of her childhood, the open fields, the familiar smell of wood smoke and earth fell away behind her, replaced by the imposing gray stone of buildings that seemed to scrape the low, cloudy sky. She was just a girl from a village so small it barely earned a dot on the map. And now she was alone. The cart driver, a man of few words who had been paid by her uncle to deliver her, finally grunted and jerked his thumb toward a tall, iron-gated house. It wasn't a castle, but to her eyes, it might as well have been. Its windows were tall and clean, reflecting the dull afternoon light. The steps leading to the front door were swept spotless. She clutched her bag until her knuckles turned white, thanked the driver with a whisper he didn't hear, and pushed open the heavy gate. It groaned, announcing her arrival. A stern-faced woman in a stark black dress and a crisp, white apron answered the servant's entrance. This was the housekeeper. Her eyes, the color of flint, swept over the girl from her worn shoes to the nervous way she held her bag. There was no smile, only a swift appraisal. "You're the new girl? You're late. Follow me. Do not touch the walls." The house inside was a world of quiet noise and strange, rich smells. It wasn't the noise of home children shouting, a dog barking, her mother banging a pot. This was a hush broken by the distant, soft chime of a clock, the whisper of a broom on carpet from another room, and the faint, sweet scent of polished wood and something like oranges. They did not go through the front hall, where a glittering chandelier hung like frozen rain, but through a maze of narrower, darker corridors at the back of the house. She was led to a small, cold room in the attic. It held a narrow bed with a thin blanket, a small washstand with a chipped bowl and pitcher, and a single high window that showed a slice of gray sky. There was no fireplace. This was to be her place. "You will be a general maid," the housekeeper said, her voice leaving no room for questions. "Scullery work mainly. Floors, pots, ashes. You will assist in the dining room when required. You are to be seen only when needed and heard not at all. The family are not to be disturbed by you. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, her throat too tight for words. "Your uniform." The housekeeper placed a pile of rough, dark fabric on the bed. "Change, then come down to the kitchen. There is work." The uniform was scratchy and hung loose on her thin frame. It marked her, instantly, as part of the machinery of the house. When she descended to the kitchen, a vast, warm, steamy room that was the complete opposite of her attic cell, she was put to work at once. There was no instruction, just commands. A mountain of copper pots from the previous night's dinner party sat waiting. A maid older than her, with tired eyes and red hands, pointed to a tub of soapy water and a coarse brush. "Get to it. They need to shine." She scrubbed. The grease was stubborn, cooked onto the pans in hard, sticky layers. The soap stung the small cracks in her skin. As she worked, the rhythm of the great house unfolded around her. Footmen in fine livery passed through, speaking in low tones. A cook bellowed orders. The scullery maid next to her whispered the names of the family. The master, a banker with a watch chain across his waistcoat. The mistress, who loved flowers and music. Their son, away at university. Their daughter, who took singing lessons. Her arms ached. Her back ached. But it was when she was sent with a bucket of soapy water and a stiff brush to clean the tiled floor of the main hallway that she saw it. The door to the front drawing room was ajar. And there, sitting in a pool of watery daylight from a tall window, was a piano. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Its wood was a deep, warm brown, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the shapes of the room. The keys were a perfect pattern of ivory and ebony, like a smile. It seemed to hold a silent song inside it, a presence in the quiet room. She must have stopped, because a sharp voice made her jump. "The housekeeper, eyes on your work. That room is not for you, and you are never, under any circumstances, to touch that instrument. It is worth more than your village. A single scratch, and you will be turned out without a reference. Do you understand?" This time she found her voice. "Yes, ma'am." It was a small, defeated sound, but the image of the piano was burned into her mind. That evening, after a silent supper of bread and broth in the kitchen with the other servants, after hauling scuttles of coal for the fireplaces, after her final task of wiping down the vast kitchen tables, she dragged herself back up to the attic. Her body felt heavy as lead, but her mind was alive with the picture of those keys. A few days later, she was given a new task, dusting the downstairs rooms early before the family awoke. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the drawing-room door. She entered, her cloth in hand. The room was hushed and still. She dusted the tables, the shelves of books she could not read, the framed paintings of stern-looking people. Finally, she stood before the piano. She laid her dusting cloth carefully on the closed lid and wiped the beautiful wood with slow, gentle strokes, feeling the grain beneath the soft cloth. Then she lifted the lid to reveal the keys. She did not dare press one. The silence was too profound, the rule too absolute. But she traced the shape of them in the air just above, her fingers remembering a different, older, out-of-tune piano in the village church hall. She remembered the feeling of making a chord, the vibration under her fingers. It was a ghost of a memory, but here, in front of this magnificent creation, it felt vivid and painful. She closed the lid and finished her work. But the piano had called to her. It was a siren song in the middle of her dreary, exhausting days. It became the center of the house for her. Every chore had a direction toward or away from that room. Carrying laundry upstairs, she would take the longer route past the drawing-room door, hoping for a glimpse. Clearing the dining room after supper, she would strain to hear if the mistress or the daughter would go in to play. Sometimes they did. The music that floated out was pleasant, polite, a correct tinkling of notes that filled the space like pretty wallpaper. She would pause, a stack of dirty plates heavy in her arms, and listen. And in her mind, she heard something else. She heard the music from her book, the one hidden under her bed. Music that surged and wept and sang of storms and longing, things her simple, hard life understood in a way the elegant, tinkling tunes could not. She began a new secret routine. On the nights when the family was out at the opera or a grand party, when the house was truly asleep, she would wait in her attic until the silence was complete. Then, barefoot, she would creep down the many flights of stairs, a mouse in the vast house. She would slip into the drawing-room, lit only by the faint moonlight. She would sit on the plush stool, her rough hands hovering over the keys. And then, with the lightest touch imaginable, she would play. Not really play, but practice the movements, pressing the keys just enough to feel their action, but not enough to make a sound that could travel. Her fingers, clumsy from scrubbing, would stumble through the patterns, remembering the chords, the runs, the passionate dynamics of the pieces she loved. It was a silent concert for an audience of one, performed in the dark. It was her only rebellion, her only comfort, the only thing in this grand, cold house that felt like hers. She was the servant girl, invisible, silent, meant for scrubbing and carrying. But in the midnight darkness, with her fingers touching the cool ivory, she was someone else entirely. She just didn't know if that other person would ever be allowed to see the light. The days began to blend into a single long stretch of work. The girl's world was defined by the heat of the kitchen range, the smell of harsh soap, and the ache in her shoulders from carrying heavy trays or coal scuttles. She learned to move through the grand rooms like a shadow, her eyes down, her footsteps quiet on the thick carpets. She became very good at being invisible, but the piano was always there, a silent presence in the back of her mind. It was a constant tug, a quiet hum beneath the drudgery. Dusting it every other morning was the high point of her week. She developed a ritual. She would first carefully wipe the closed lid, feeling the smooth, cool lacquer. Then she would lift it slowly, the hinge giving a soft, well-oiled sigh. The keys seemed to glow in the morning light, waiting. She would dust around them, around the elegant gold lettering of the maker's name, but she never let the cloth touch the ivory. For that, she used a separate, softer bit of flannel she kept in her apron pocket, gently polishing each key with a touch so light it made no sound. One morning, as she was finishing this secret ceremony, the mistress of the house entered the room. The girl froze, the flannel clutched in her hand, expecting a sharp reprimand. But the mistress, a kind-faced woman who often seemed lost in her own thoughts, merely smiled faintly. "You take good care of it, I see," she said, her voice soft. "It's a sensitive instrument. It dislikes rough treatment and damp cloths. It's very beautiful." "Ma'am," the girl whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Yes," the mistress sighed, running her own slender, ringed hand along the curve of the wood. "It is. My daughter is meant to learn, but she lacks the patience for practice." She looked at the girl, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time. "Do you like music?" The question was so unexpected, it was like a splash of cold water. The girl's heart jumped. I don't know any, ma'am. Proper music, I mean." The mistress nodded, as if that was the only sensible answer a servant girl could give. "Well, it is a comfort, a great comfort." And she drifted out of the room again, leaving the girl alone with the piano and a strange, hollow feeling in her chest. That hollow feeling grew into a dangerous idea. The family went out to a concert one evening. The house was emptier than usual, the silence deeper. The girl lay in her narrow attic bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The memory of the mistress's hand on the piano, the mention of practice, echoed in her mind. It was as if a door had been left slightly ajar. She slipped from her bed. The floorboards were icy under her bare feet. She didn't even put on her shawl. She moved down through the dark house, her path memorized, avoiding the one step on the main staircase that always creaked. The drawing room was pitch black, the furniture just darker shapes against the windows. She went straight to the piano. This time, she didn't just trace the keys in the air. She sat on the stool, its leather cool through her thin nightdress. She took a deep, shaky breath and placed her fingers on the keys. They felt alive under her touch dot, and then she pressed one. The note was so loud in the absolute silence, it seemed to vibrate through the entire house. She snatched her hand back, her blood turning to ice. She sat rigid, listening for any sound of disturbance, a door opening, a voice calling. There was nothing, only the fading echo of that single pure note. Terror and a wild, thrilling joy fought inside her. It was the first real sound she had drawn from the instrument. After a minute that felt like an hour, she tried again. This time, she was ready for the volume. She played a simple scale, the one she remembered from the church hall, pressing the keys as softly as she could. The sound was still clear and beautiful, but it was a whisper compared to what the piano could do. It felt safe. That was the beginning of her true secret life. Once or twice a week, when the house was deeply asleep or the family was away for the evening, she would visit her friend in the drawing room. She never lit a lamp. The moonlight, or the faint glow from a street lamp outside, was enough. She started with the simple things she remembered, her fingers stiff and uncooperative at first, betraying her long days of manual labor. But slowly, the memory in her muscles began to wake up. She had brought with her from home not just clothes, but a treasure. It was a book of music, given to her years ago by the old musician who passed through her village. It was tattered, the cover nearly off, and the notations were complex, far beyond what she had ever learned. But she had studied it like a holy text, tracing the lines of the notes with her finger, hearing the music in her head. It was a book of etudes by Chopin pieces, meant for practice, but which were themselves full of wild, stormy emotion. She couldn't play them. Not really. But she began to try. She would work on a single measure for an entire night, her fingers finding the shapes, struggling with the stretches. She played so softly, the sound barely left the piano bench, a ghost of the music it was meant to be. It was frustrating, exhausting work. But it was also the most alive she had ever felt. One night, she was so absorbed in a particularly difficult passage, a cascade of running notes, that she didn't hear the soft click of the drawing-room door. She didn't know she was no longer alone until a voice spoke from the darkness. "So it is you." The girl nearly fell off the stool. She spun around, her hands flying to her chest. It was the older scullery maid, the one with the tired eyes, standing in the doorway holding a candle. Her face was unreadable in the flickering light. I was just... The girl stammered, tears of panic springing to her eyes. She was finished. She would be thrown out into the street at dawn. The older maid stepped into the room and closed the door quietly behind her. She didn't look angry. She looked curious and perhaps a little sad. "I've heard the ghosts playing for weeks," she said softly. "Thought I was going mad. Then I saw you come down last week." "I'm sorry," the girl whispered, shaking. "I'll stop. Please don't tell." The maid was silent for a long moment, her eyes on the gleaming piano. "My brother," she said finally, her voice low. "He could play. Not on something fine like this. On a broken old thing in a pub. But he could make it sing." She looked at the girl. "You have that same look he got. Like you're not really here when you're doing it." She walked over and put the candle holder down on a small table. "Play it," she said. "What?" "Play it properly. Not this mouse music. Let it hear what it's supposed to sound like. Just for a minute." The girl stared at her. Then, slowly, she turned back to the piano. Her heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her ears. She thought of the first piece in her book, the one she knew best in her heart. She placed her hands, took a breath that was also a prayer, and played. She didn't play it softly. For the first time, she let her fingers fall with intention, letting the piano resonate. The music that filled the dark room was nothing like the polite tinkling of the daughter's lessons. It was full of longing, a melancholy melody that rose and fell like a breath. It was messy. She missed a note in the middle, her finger slipping. But the feeling was there, raw and true, flowing out of her and into the keys. She stopped after less than a minute, the last note hanging in the air between them. She couldn't bring herself to look at the other maid. The room was quiet again, except for the pop of the candle flame. Then the maid let out a long, slow breath. "Well," she said. There was a new respect in her voice. "That's something else, that is." She picked up her candle. "I'll not be telling anyone," she said. "Your secret's safe with me? But for heaven's sake, keep it quiet. If the housekeeper catches you, we'll both be for the street." She gave the girl a tight, almost smile. Ghosts should know how to be quiet. And she left, closing the door silently behind her. The girl sat in the dark for a long time, her body trembling not from fear now, but from a release she didn't understand. She had been seen. Her secret had been shared, and it had not destroyed her. It was a fragile thread of connection in her lonely world. She touched the keys one last time, a gentle chord, a thank you. Then she closed the lid and crept back to her attic. The house was still asleep. Her world was still one of scrubbed floors and silent service. But something had shifted. The music was no longer just a dream in the dark. It was a living thing inside her, and now it had a witness. The secret understanding with the older scullery maid changed everything and nothing. They never spoke of it again in the bright light of the kitchen. But sometimes, when passing each other with a heavy bucket or a stack of linen, their eyes would meet. The older woman would give the smallest, quickest nod. It was a tiny anchor of solidarity in the girl's lonely world. The midnight practices continued, a little less terrifying now, though she was always careful, her ears straining for any sound beyond the soft whisper of the keys. The house was preparing for an event. A real event, not just a dinner party. It was to be a musical soiree, the mistress had announced. A famous pianist, a friend of a friend, was passing through the city and had agreed to perform. The finest families were invited. The house went into a frenzy of polishing, cooking, and arranging. For a week, the girl's world was a blur of extra work. Every piece of silver had to shine like a mirror. Every crystal glass had to be free of a single smudge. The grand drawing room, usually a quiet space, was bustling. Chairs were brought in from other rooms. The piano was tuned by a serious-looking man with a case of tools who spent hours inside it, making tiny adjustments while striking single. Pure notes over and over. The girl watched him, fascinated, from the hallway as she dusted the banister. She saw the care he took, the way he listened, his head cocked like a bird. She heard the piano's voice become clearer, brighter, more perfectly in harmony with itself. It was ready for a master. The thought sent a strange pang through her, a mix of awe and a deep personal sadness. This instrument she had come to think of as her silent confidant was about to sing for a room full of people, in a way she never could. The evening arrived. The house was transformed. Light from 100 candles in the chandelier glittered off the silver and crystal. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, perfume, and the fragrant dishes coming from the kitchen. The guests arrived in a rustle of silk and a murmur of polished conversation. The girl, in her stiff, clean uniform, felt more invisible than ever. She was part of the scenery, a moving piece of furniture tasked with carrying trays of delicate champagne flutes. She weaved through the crowd, her eyes down, offering the glasses. Laughter and talk swirled around her, conversations about politics, art, and gossip she didn't understand. She saw the famous pianist, a middle-aged man with kind, tired eyes and elegant hands. He stood near the fireplace, nodding politely at something the master of the house was saying. Finally, the performance began. The guests settled into their chairs. The girl was positioned near the door to the hall, ready to fetch anything that was needed. The pianist sat at her piano. He adjusted the stool, flexed his fingers, and began. The music that filled the room was unlike anything she had ever heard live. It was powerful, confident, a river of sound that was both complex and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was the music from her book, but brought to life with a mastery she could only dream of. He didn't just play the notes. He told a story with them. A story of storms and sunshine, of deep sorrow and sudden, soaring joy. She forgot she was a servant. She forgot to be invisible. She stood transfixed, her empty tray hanging at her side, her soul drinking in every note. Tears, which she quickly blinked away, pricked at her eyes. This was what music could be. This was its true voice. The pianist finished to a moment of perfect silence, followed by a wave of enthusiastic applause. He took a modest bow. The spell was broken. The guests rose, chatting excitedly, buzzing with the shared experience. More champagne was called for. The girl sprang back into motion, collecting empty glasses, her mind still echoing with the music. As the night wore on, the atmosphere loosened. The champagne flowed freely. The conversations grew louder, the laughter more frequent and less restrained. The girl was circulating with a fresh tray when a group of young men, sons of wealthy families, caught her attention. They were standing near the piano, their faces flushed with drink and amusement. One of them, a tall fellow with a loud, confident voice, was holding court. He had been trying and failing to impress a young lady with his knowledge of music. The girl tried to slip past them, but as she did, she couldn't help but glance at the piano. Her eyes lingered for a second too long on the keys, still slightly shifted from the pianist's final chord. The loud young man followed her gaze. A slow, mean smile spread across his face. He saw a target, a way to deflect from his own embarrassment. "Well, look here," he announced, his voice cutting above the hum of the room. Several people turned. "It seems we have a critic in our midst. The little maid is judging the instrument's quality." A few people chuckled politely. The girl froze, her face burning. She tried to move away, but he stepped slightly, blocking her path in a casual, cruel way. No, don't run off," he said, his tone mockingly gentle. "You were studying it so intently. Perhaps you have a better ear than our esteemed guest. Maybe you'd like to offer us an alternative interpretation?" This drew a louder laugh from his friends. The girl felt the eyes of the room upon her. She saw the mistress's face, concerned and embarrassed. She saw the master frowning. She saw the famous pianist looking away as if pained by the scene. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "Come now," the young man pressed, enjoying the spotlight. "Don't be shy. We're all lovers of music here. Let's hear what a true worker can do with it. A simple folk tune, perhaps? Something from your village?" The cruelty was now naked. He wasn't asking for music. He was asking for a joke. He was offering her up as the evening's entertainment, a clumsy peasant to contrast with the refined artistry they had just witnessed. The laughter was sharper now, more widespread. People were watching, not with malice, but with a bored, expectant curiosity. A diversion. Tears of shame blurred the girl's vision. She shook her head, a tiny, desperate movement. Her throat was locked shut. It was then that the master of the house spoke. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man of his time and station, embarrassed by a scene caused by a servant. He saw a simple way to end the awkwardness, to let the young buck have his little joke and then move on. He thought he was being almost kind. "Go on, then, girl," he said, his voice firm, carrying across the room. A hush fell. "Let's have your tune. Let's see what you can do." He said it like he was humoring a child or a pet. It was a command, not an invitation. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. Every elegant face in the room was turned toward her. The older scullery maid, who had been peeking from the hall, met her eyes for a split second, a look of pure horror. The girl was trapped. There was no refusing the master. To run would be to lose her position for certain. To play a clumsy, simple tune would be the humiliation they all expected, a confirmation of their world's order. The weight of their collective gaze amused, pitying, impatient pressed down on her like a physical force. Slowly, mechanically, she set her silver tray down on a small side table. The clink of it on the marble was shockingly loud. She wiped her damp palms on her rough apron. Then, with her head bowed so low, her chin nearly touched her chest, she walked through the parting crowd toward the piano. The journey felt a mile long. The beautiful rug beneath her feet, the smell of perfume and wine, the glittering light, it all seemed to swim around her. She reached the instrument. The famous pianist's sheet music was still open on the stand. It was the very piece he had played so magnificently. She closed the book gently. She could not read that complex language anyway. She adjusted the stool, her movements slow, almost dreamlike. She sat down. The plush seat was still warm from the maestro. The sea of expectant, smirking faces was a blur in her peripheral vision. She placed her work-roughened, red hands on the glorious ivory keys. They felt familiar and alien all at once. This was not her silent, midnight friend. This was a beast in a brightly lit arena, and she was about to be devoured. She took a breath that shuddered in her chest. In her mind, she was not in the drawing room. She was in the dark, with only the moonlight and the ghost of a chord for company. And then she began to play. The first notes were not a melody. They were a low, deep chord that seemed to rise from the very bottom of the piano, a low hum that vibrated in the floorboards. It was the sound of a door opening into a dark, vast space. It was not the tinkling, hesitant sound anyone expected. It was a statement. The room, which had been holding its breath for a comedy, flinched. The smirks on the faces of the young men faltered. This was not a folk tune. This was not anything they knew. The girl's eyes were closed. She was not in their world anymore. She was inside the music that had lived in her head and heart for years. The music from the tattered book. The music she had practiced as a ghost. Her hands, which looked so rough and out of place, moved with a sudden, sure grace. The initial chord melted into a rippling cascade of notes, clear and cold as a mountain stream, running down the length of the keyboard. It was intricate, precise, and filled with a delicate, aching sadness. A woman in the front row let out a small, sharp gasp and put a hand to her chest. The master of the house, who had been standing with his arms crossed, slowly uncrossed them. His face went blank with shock. The music began to tell its story. It was a Chopin etude, one meant for developing agility, but in the hands of a true feeling, it became a portrait of longing. The left hand established a restless, pulsing rhythm, like an anxious heartbeat. Over the top, the right hand wove a melody that seemed to be constantly searching, reaching for something just out of grasp, falling back, and trying again. It was not played with the flawless, polished technique of the famous pianist. There was a rawness to it. A note here, or there was not perfectly crisp. A run was not perfectly even. But what it lacked in technical perfection, it drowned in pure, undeniable emotion. The girl poured everything into the keys. The loneliness of her attic room, the ache in her muscles from scrubbing, the silence she was forced to keep, the beauty of the moonlight on the piano, the crushing weight of their laughter, all of it flowed down her arms and into her fingers. The music swelled, becoming more passionate, more stormy. It was a cry that her voice had never been allowed to make. The famous pianist was no longer looking away. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his mouth slightly open. He was not listening to mistakes. He was listening to the soul of the piece. He was hearing an understanding of the music that went beyond mere practice. This was not imitation. This was someone speaking Chopin's language, as if it were their native tongue. The cruel young man who had started it all had lost all color in his face. His sneer had vanished, replaced by a kind of stunned confusion. He didn't understand what he was hearing, but he understood, with a sickening clarity, that he had made a catastrophic error. He had not unveiled a clown. He had unleashed a prophet. The girl moved into a section of the piece that was all turbulence and wind. Her body moved with the music now, a slight sway from her waist, her shoulders rising and falling. She was no longer a servant girl on a stool. She was a conduit. The powerful, complex chords filled the grand room, bouncing off the high ceilings, washing over the audience who were now utterly, completely captive. No one coughed. No one rustled a program. They were frozen, some with hands half raised to their mouths, others with tears welling in their eyes, without knowing why. In the hallway, the older scullery maid stood with a hand clamped over her own mouth, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. She had heard the ghost, but this was the living, breathing spirit, and it was magnificent. The mistress of the house was crying softly, a lace handkerchief pressed to her lips. She heard it. She heard the loneliness, the beauty trapped inside the quiet, dusty girl. She felt a shame so deep it was a physical pain. She had owned the piano, but this girl, all this time, had owned the music. The piece raced towards its conclusion. The storm within it reached a fever pitch, a furious, beautiful conflict of sound. And then, suddenly, it broke. The music fell away into a series of soft, falling notes, like sighs after a great weep. The final notes were played with a tenderness that was almost unbearable. A gentle resolution that spoke of exhaustion, not peace, but of a feeling finally, completely spent. The last note faded into the silent room. The girl's hands fell from the keys and lay still in her lap. Her head remained bowed. Her shoulders slumped forward, as if the energy that had possessed her had vanished, leaving only the tired servant behind. She did not move. She was waiting for the world to crash back in. What followed was not applause. It was a profound, ringing silence, heavier and more meaningful than any noise. It was the sound of 100 people having their world quietly, irrevocably turned upside down. The air itself seemed charged, thick with shared shock and awe. The famous pianist was the first to move. He stood up. He did not clap. He simply placed his hands together, fingers to his lips, and gave a slow, deep nod in the girl's direction. It was a gesture of respect from one musician to another. It was all the approval that mattered. Then a storm of sound erupted. It wasn't the polite, measured applause from before. It was a sudden, explosive clapping, mixed with shouts of bravo and extraordinary. People rose to their feet. They were not applauding a party trick. They were acclaiming an artist they had just discovered in the most shocking way imaginable. The girl flinched at the noise, finally looking up. The blur of faces was no longer smirking. They were alight with amazement, with apology, with fervor. She saw the master staring at her, his face unreadable. She saw the mistress weeping openly. She saw the young man who had mocked her, now shrunk back behind others, invisible in his disgrace. It was too much. The weight of their eyes, now filled with this new, terrifying admiration, was worse than the mockery. She had wanted to be invisible again, but that was impossible. She had burned her anonymity to the ground with the fire of the music. She pushed the stool back. It screeched on the floor. The applause faltered for a second, expecting a bow, a speech, something. But the girl just stood up. She gave a small, automatic curtsy, a servant's gesture, utterly at odds with the performance she had just given. Then she turned and walked, not ran, but walked with a stiff, quick pace, away from the piano, through the crowd that parted for her in a new kind of silence. She did not look left or right. She went straight to the door, into the hallway, past the weeping scullery maid, and disappeared into the dark back passages of the house. The applause from the drawing room continued, muffled now by the walls, a distant thunder that followed her. She did not go to the kitchen. She did not go to her attic. She went to the only place that made sense, the small, cold pantry off the kitchen, where the potatoes and onions were stored. She closed the door, plunging herself into total darkness, and slid down against the wall onto the cold stone floor. In the dark, surrounded by the smell of earth and roots, she finally began to shake. Great, silent tremors racked her body. She had done it. She had played her heart out in the light, and now she had no idea what came next. The world she knew was gone. The silence she hid in was broken. And the beautiful, terrible music was now out in the open, and it could never be put back. The cold from the stone pantry floor seeped through her uniform, but the girl barely felt it. The trembling in her hands was slowly subsiding, replaced by a hollow numbness. From the distant drawing room, she could still hear the murmur of voices, a dull hum that was no longer applause. The party was continuing, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the stones, that it was a different party now. She had been the earthquake, and now everyone was trying to stand on ground that had shifted. She didn't know how long she sat there in the dark. It was the sound of the kitchen door swinging open, the sudden burst of light, and the clatter of urgent activity that roused her. The guests would be wanting their coats, their carriages called. The performance was over, in every sense. She stood, her joints stiff, and smoothed her apron. She slipped out of the pantry and into the whirlwind of the kitchen. The other servants were moving with frantic energy, but as she entered, a strange stillness rippled through the room. Conversations halted. Eyes wide and uncertain flicked toward her and then quickly away. The head cook opened her mouth as if to give an order, then closed it, turning back to the stove with a confused frown. The girl was no longer just the scullery maid. She was the girl who played the piano like an angel. Nobody knew what to do with that dot. She found a tray and began to collect empty glasses and discarded plates from the servants' hall, losing herself in the familiar, physical work. It was the older scullery maid who finally approached her at the deep sink, where they both stood scrubbing in silence for a moment. "Well?" the older woman said quietly, her voice rough. She didn't look up from the pot she was scouring. "That shut them up, didn't it?" The girl said nothing, just scrub it harder at a bit of dried gravy. "He asked for you. You know," the maid continued, even softer. "The piano man, the famous one, asked the mistress where you'd gone. Wanted to speak to you." A fresh wave of panic tightened the girl's chest. She shook her head, a tiny, desperate movement. "Didn't think you'd want to," the maid nodded. "They've all gone now, anyway." The house eventually settled into an uneasy quiet. The clocks ticked loudly in the emptiness. When the girl finally climbed the stairs to her attic, every step felt heavier than the last. She expected the housekeeper to be waiting for her, to dismiss her on the spot for the unprecedented scene she had caused. But the corridor was empty. Her small room was as cold and silent as she had left it. The next morning dawned gray and ordinary. She rose at the same hour, put on the same scratchy uniform, and descended to the kitchen. The routine was the same. Stoke the fire, set the kettle, begin preparing the morning tray for the mistress. But the air was thick with a silence that was not peaceful. The master's newspaper rustled more sharply than usual in the breakfast room. The daughter of the house, who usually skipped down the stairs, walked past the kitchen door with a curious, almost wary glance inside. It was the mistress who sent for her mid-morning. The girl's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood in the morning room, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. The mistress was not at her writing desk. She was standing by the window, looking out at the garden. "Close the door, please," she said, without turning. The girl did so. The click of the latch was final. The mistress turned. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. She looked at the girl for a long time, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Her voice was not harsh. It was full of a bewildered sadness. The girl stared at the pattern on the carpet. There was a piano. "In my village church, a man. He was passing through. He showed me some things. A long time ago. And the rest? The choppin'? I have a book, ma'am." The whisper was almost inaudible. I practiced. At night, when everyone was asleep. I am sorry. I know I wasn't to touch it." The mistress waved a hand, dismissing the transgression as if it were nothing. The crime of touching the piano was utterly insignificant now. "You did not just practice," she said softly. You understood it. You felt it. She paused, struggling with her words. Why did you never say anything? The girl finally looked up, confused. What could she have said? Asterisk Lise mime. While I scrubbed your floors, I am also a musical genius? The absurdity of it hung in the air between them. Her station was her answer. The mistress saw the answer in her eyes and flinched. My daughter takes lessons from the finest teacher in the city, the mistress said, more to herself than to the girl. She plays the notes correctly. She does not make the room weep. She took a step closer. The gentleman who played last night, he left his card. For you. He said if your circumstances were to change, he could recommend you to a conservatory for proper study. The words hung in the air, glittering and impossible. A conservatory. A life of music. A path out of the attic. The girl's breath caught. For a second, a wild, golden light seemed to flash in the dark tunnel of her future. Then the mistress looked away, out the window again. It is, of course, impossible, she said, her voice regaining its practiced, gentle firmness. Such a path is not. It is not for someone in your position. The talk, the scandal. It would be unmanageable. For you and for this house. The golden light snuffed out. The girl felt nothing. She had known, really. The world did not work that way. A door had been opened just to show her the beautiful garden on the other side, and then gently, firmly closed. However, the mistress continued, turning back. A new, awkward resolve was in her posture. Things cannot continue exactly as they were. It would be unseemly and a waste. She cleared her throat. You will no longer work in the scullery. You will be reassigned as a parlor maid. Your duties will be lighter. You will keep the drawing room and the piano in order, and she hesitated as if the next words were a strange, foreign recipe. You may play it in the afternoons when the family is out, for 1 hour, to keep your skill. It was a peace offering, a bone thrown from the high table to a strange, talented dog. It was meant as kindness. It was kindness of a certain limited sort. She was being promoted from scrubbing pots to dusting shelves. She was being given permission to do, in a limited, secretive way, the very thing that was her soul's breath. It was a victory and a defeat, all wrapped together. Thank you, Mom, the girl said, because there was nothing else to say. Life in the house settled into a new pattern. She moved her few things to a slightly larger room on a lower floor, one with a small fireplace. She wore a slightly less coarse dress. She dusted the drawing room in the mornings, and now, in the quiet of certain afternoons, she would sit at a piano and play. Not as a ghost, but not as a free artist either. She played with the windows closed, the sound contained. It was a sanctioned secret. The family never spoke of the soiree again. The master would sometimes pause outside the drawing-room door if she was playing, listening for a moment before moving on. The daughter stopped her own lessons soon after, the comparison too bitter to bear. The famous pianist's card was kept, a relic of a bewildering night, tucked away in the mistress's jewelry box. The other servants treated her with a cautious distance. She was neither one of them nor one of the family. She was something in between, a puzzle. Only the older scullery maid remained the same, sharing a silent pot of tea with her in the kitchen sometimes, their friendship sealed by shared secrecy. The girl played her afternoon hour. She grew more proficient, the rawness of her technique smoothing with consistent, open practice. But the wild, weeping passion of that one night was never quite the same. It had been a lightning strike, a brilliant, blinding flash that revealed everything and could not be repeated on command. She had her music now, but it was a bird in a gilded cage. She had escaped the scullery, but she was more trapped than ever. because she had been shown a vision of a self she could never fully become. They had laughed at the servant girl, and she had silenced them forever with a beauty that left them stunned. But in the silence that followed, she remained exactly where she was, the girl who played the piano, alone in a room, waiting for an hour to pass, while the world outside, with all its possibilities, carried on without her. The memory of her music became a legend in the house, a story told in whispers, but for her, it was simply the sound of her own heart, echoing in a room that was still, in all the ways that mattered, a very beautiful prison.